Hello, everyone. Today we're reading The Apprentice, chapters 4 through 6. Now, in previous chapters, we heard that Adrino is currently working for the maestro as his apprentice, which means his helper, who is learning to become a painter. So the maestro is the master painter, and Adrino is his helper, who is learning how to become a painter himself. So we're going to go ahead and start with chapter 4. It says, "During the days that followed, light and work filled my thoughts. But when the shadows began to dull the colors of the paintings in the studio, and Melania began to shout about wasting oil and candles, so that we would hurry to bed, I was overwhelmed by an anguish, meaning a sadness, that washed over me like a wave. It seemed pointless to ask more questions about the attic. The other boys knew less than I did. They didn't even seem to care. In order to find out what was up there, I would have to go on my own, and it would have to be at night. It was impossible to linger anywhere near the stairway during the day. If the maestro wasn't with us in the studio, we were never far from Melania's watchful gaze. It wasn't long before I decided one night to carry out my investigation. The moon was full, and everyone was sleeping. Melania had made her silent visit to the attic an hour or so earlier. The only sounds in the house were the familiar popping of the last logs in the fire and the maestro's snore, which echoed through the corridor, meaning the hallway. It was time to go upstairs. I got up quietly and waited to be sure that no one had heard me. I stepped away from the corner that served as my bedroom and stood at the bottom of the stairway. There were 5 steps that led up to the small landing. Then the staircase turned up to the attic. I held out onto the rope that was anchored, meaning stuck to, the wall, which served as a banister, meaning a railing, and slowly began to climb the stairs. I reached the first landing and peered through the shadows. I could make out another landing at the top with a large door just beyond it. When I reached the top, I leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. I had the sensation that my ears had grown, straining to hear any sounds. The door was black and studded with rusted nail heads. I held the latch down and pushed, but the door was locked. I tried looking through the keyhole, but it seemed to be blocked or covered from another side. I was thinking about giving up when a shuffling sound made me jump. I grabbed onto the rope banister and continued running downstairs as fast as I could, yelling until I had awakened the whole household. Something held me back. I took another deep breath and turned to examine the wall next to the door. Something near the door, to the right of the door, moved in the shadows. I held my breath. My heartbeat seemed loud enough to wake all of Florence. I bent down to get a closer look. It looked like a piece of fabric. I touched it. It was heavy, like a tapestry, meaning a giant painting. But why was it moving? I mopped my brow, meaning my forehead, and swallowed hard. Very slowly, I pulled back the corner of the tapestry and saw, about a foot off the floor, a small, barred window that opened onto a room silvered in moonlight. The air that came through the bars smelled of acrid dampness. That means it smells gross, like when you open your closet and your stinky shoes have smelled up the whole closet. I sat down on the floor and peered through the bars. The attic was a large, empty room with a barred window, which was open, letting in the moonlight and the cold of the street. There were no shelves or cupboards with alchemist's equipment against the walls, nor were there books or even a table and a bench. I saw no bodies, no ghosts, no dragons, just a pail, a dish, some rags, and on the wall a huge black iron ring and chain that reached a bundle of tattered blankets on the floor. The bundle was breathing. Mother of God, I thought. I tried to move, but my legs seemed to have stuck themselves to the floor. It was then that I heard a soft voice. Who are you? Adrino, I answered. The bundle had spoken. It was a man. He pushed aside the blanket that covered his head, and the moonlight showed on his hair. Good night, I stammered and dropped the tapestry. Wait, he cried. I couldn't move. "Adreno, please," he said. "Please don't go." His voice was that of a young man, only a few years older than me. I pulled back the tapestry again. He was sitting under the open window against the wall. The chain I had seen stretched across the room ended in a shackle, meaning a handcuff, around his ankle. "Thank you," he said when he saw me. You, you, I. So many questions crowded my thoughts that I couldn't say anything clearly. "Are you one of Cosimo's apprentices?" he asked. "Yes. My name is Donato." Donato, my voice creaked. "Why are you chained up in here?" "Because," he said, "I was foolish. Please, please tell me, how are things downstairs? I only see Melania, and she never speaks to me." I shrugged my shoulders. "I've only been here for a week," I answered. "I don't know if things are going well or badly." "Is there very much work?" "Not really, though they are finishing a panel and there's a drawing in progress." "There's nothing else?" he asked, sounding surprised. "Not that I know of." He leaned toward the barred window and pushed the hair out of his face. "Is there a specialist in the studio?" he asked. I had never heard of such a thing. "I don't think so," I said. He looked at me and smiled. "A specialist is an expert in one particular part of a painting. There are specialists in backgrounds, in hands, in the folds of tunics and hangings." "I've never seen any specialists," I answered. "Marco does the backgrounds, and the maestro paints the rest." "Marco is still here?" he exclaimed softly. "What about Raffaello?" "No, aside from me and Marco, there's only Baldo and Piero. There are four of us together. They're new since I've been up here. Raffaello probably ran away after I was imprisoned." "Why are you chained up in there?" I asked again. There was a pause before he spoke. "The maestro thought that I painted better than he did. I never felt that way. I thought he was a genius, but I wasn't clever enough to hide my talent. I had been his apprentice for 3 years and spoke openly about plans to open my own studio. He got hysterical when he heard about it. He couldn't bear the thought of competing with me for commissions, that means for jobs. He said I was a traitor." I couldn't believe my ears. Could the maestro really have been jealous? Jealous means he wants what another person has. "How long have you been in here?" I asked. Donato looked at some scratches on the wall near the iron ring. 14 months, he said, sighing. 14 months, I said, stunned. "How have you managed to stand it?" "What else could I do?" he said. "At the beginning I was desperate. I wouldn't eat what Melania brought up to me, but I was starving and nobody cared whether I ate or not. I yelled many times, but no one ever came. The wisest thing I could do was wait." "What about the other boys?" "Marco and I weren't exactly friends, and Raffaello was quite timid. In any case, nobody sees or even knows anything that Cosimo doesn't want him to. Even though you've only been here a short time, you should know that." It was true. No one contradicted the maestro. Apprentices are legally bound to obey their masters. "But what about your family?" I asked him. "Haven't they looked for you?" Donato took a deep breath and began his story. "I have no family left. I was an orphan when I came to Cosimo. Both my parents and my sister had died several months earlier from a fever that I somehow survived. My father was a merchant and made good money, so when he was alive, I was able to go to the best schools, where I studied art, the sciences, philosophy, and literature. But my father didn't have much savings, and when he died, most of what he did have was used to pay debts. I had always known that I wanted to be an artist, so after all the debts were paid, I used the money that was left for an apprenticeship." He paused and continued. "From the moment he had my money, Cosimo took full advantage of the fact that I was orphaned. He thought he owned me. I would never have been able to stand it for so long. I would have gone mad," I said. Mad means crazy. "For a while, I thought I was going mad too, but little by little, I realized that losing my mind was useless, so was feeling sorry for myself. I decided to adapt to the situation, which is the only reason I survived as long as I have." "But you must be so lonely." I am very cold and hungry and lonely, and being lonely is the worst. But I also have time to think. Because of my window, I can see the sun and the moon and the birds. I even know when things are happening here in Florence. What do you mean? The window is so high up, you can't possibly see very much out of it. Of course not, Donato said. But I knew when it was Christmas because I could hear the noises of the market and smell the roasting meat, and I knew when it was carnival because I heard the songs and the children shouting. San Lorenzo's bell tells me when it's Sunday, and where there's a wedding or a funeral or a fire. He used to wipe his face with the back of his hand. I've even managed to get used to living with spiders and mice. Ugh, I'd have died of fright, I said. Fright, meaning scared. Donato looked at me with surprise. Sometimes I think I'm a terrible coward, meaning he's too scared for anything. I said. The prisoner shifted against the wall. He sighed and said softly, You are the only boy who's dared to come up here in 14 months. I don't believe you are a coward, even though you say so yourself. I'm still shaking. That doesn't mean anything. The moon, indifferent, meaning not caring, to our conversation had moved across the sky, and now only a sliver of light came through the open window. It's getting very late, I said. I should go down to my bed. Stay just a little while longer, Adrino. It's been so long since I've talked to anyone. If you never talk to anyone, how have you managed to keep your voice? I asked. Thanks to the poetry that I remember from my studies, especially the work of Dante. Dante was a very great poet during this time period. As a student, I memorized many of the verses of his Comida. In the past 14 months, I have repeated them countless times, savoring their sound, thinking about the meaning of the words, and meditating over their theme. I was mesmerized by his words, his story. The maestro's hoarse cough in the distance startled us both. I have to go, I said, panicked. If he finds me up here, who knows what he'll do? Will you visit me again? I hesitated. I didn't think about anything except getting downstairs. Well, his sad gaze helped me decide. Yes, I will come back as soon as I can. That's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5. You blasted boys, the devil take you. Don't you simpletons, meaning stupid people, know the work doesn't do itself? Melania's yelling roused me, meaning woke me up from my half sleep. After meeting Donato, I had spent the rest of the night tossing and turning on my pallet under the stairs. Daylight chased the ghosts from my imagination, but throughout the morning I could hardly concentrate on my chores. What should I do? I had discovered a crime. It wasn't legal to keep someone locked up in the attic against his will. My obligation, meaning my job, was to denounce, meaning say something, about the maestro to the authorities, but the man terrified me. And who would believe me, a lowly apprentice? What's the matter with you? Baldo interrupted my thoughts. Nothing. I decided to keep my knowledge of Donato a secret. We sat down together in the kitchen at the hearth, meaning the fireplace, to eat our lunch. Nothing, he repeated, squinting at me. Nothing. I know, he said. You're sick of work. I nodded. It was true. I was tired of cleaning. Who wouldn't be? Besides, if I told him he was right, he might stop asking me prying questions, meaning questions he didn't want to answer. Yes, I'm tired of it, I said. The maestro only lets me touch the brushes if he wants me to clean them. He hasn't asked me to sketch or even trace a line since the day I arrived. I feel like a servant. Well, you've got a long way to go. I've been here almost a year, and the maestro only lets me watch him draw. He never lets me try it for myself. He stared into the fire and shook his head as if to chase away evil thoughts. The truth is, he continued, I don't care. Painting, it bores me. His tone was scornful, meaning mad. You don't like painting? I asked, incredulous, meaning upset. Then what are you doing here? He moved back and forth on his ample backside and whispered, They're making me learn. I told you, my grandfather is Antonio Ferruccio. My family wants me to carry on his art and his business. Either I learn with Cosimo or I learn with him. He paused for a moment before continuing in a more serious tone. My grandfather is a greedy tyrant. A tyrant is someone who's angry and forces people to do what they want all the time. He doesn't let me do anything he hasn't ordered me to do. He gives me barely enough food to stay alive, and he uses a whip with more skill than he does a paintbrush. The maestro doesn't teach me much, and he works me hard, but he doesn't beat me. And the food isn't good, but it's enough. I even manage to get extras now and then. If I could, though, what I'd really like to do is learn to cook. My dream is to be a chef in a rich man's house, a house full of pastries. I could only shake my head. The son of tailors wants to be a painter. The son of painters, a chef. I wondered what the son of a chef would want to be. I spent the next few days in the studio sanding down boards and preparing them with a mixture of plaster, which is the white stuff that goes on the outside of your house, glue, and water that Piero had made up. It filled the house with a strangely purifying aroma, meaning it's very stinky. I hadn't been up to see Donato since my first visit. I didn't want to take any chances. Spread it carefully, barked the maestro. Make it perfectly smooth, or the brush strokes will show. Lately, it seemed the maestro spent lots of his time in the studio, sitting with a warm wool compress, meaning a cloth that has beans or rice inside of it to make it warm, on his stomach. From time to time, he would yell for Melania to come and change it, which she did with no complaints. My thoughts kept turning to Donato. Although I had never liked the maestro, now that I knew about Donato, his presence was more than I could bear. I was filled with the desire to take the pestle I had used to grind pigments and to beat him with it. But when he looked at me, my thoughts froze. In my frustration, I began to doubt. What do I care about Donato? I asked myself as I covered the boards with the plaster mixture. I don't really know the boy in the attic. He's not related to me. He's not my friend. I shouldn't put my future at risk. Painting is more important to me than anything. But I knew deep down what was right. It was a crime to kidnap someone and keep him prisoner. No man can own another. It was a crime. But what could I do? At the end of the day, Melania came into the studio to assign our evening chores. Piero, go and get firewood, she shouted. Adrino, you fetch the water. Baldo, go around and close all the shutters. We're going to have a hard frost tonight, meaning lots of snow. When you're done, your supper will be ready. Frost had already covered the cobbles of the courtyard, and the rope that held the bucket in the well was stiff. Both Piero and Baldo finished their chores before me and were seated at the kitchen hearth when I returned from the well. Piero had kindly moved my bowl close to the fire to keep it warm. But when he opened the door, my poor uncle found a demon with a toad's face and devil's horns. He pushed my uncle into the paddock, and with a cord made of dried braided snake, as they did nearly every night at dinner time, Melania's horrible stories held us in rapt attention, meaning very, very exciting. And we forgot about the thin, rancid, meaning gross, soup we ate and the sweetly sticky odor of the oil lamp. When we had finished eating and she had finished her tale, we cleaned up and went off to bed. Late that night, after everyone, including Melania, was fast asleep, I left my tiny corner and listened to the sounds of the household, the maestro's snores, the last logs in the kitchen hearth falling to embers, meaning tiny pieces, the elm branch that scratched the studio wall window, the creaking of the beams, but nothing out of the ordinary. I climbed the stairs to the attic, sat down next to the barred window, lifted the tapestry, and looked in. Light from the full moon flooded the tiny room. Donato, seated on the floor and wrapped in a blanket, was eating. Donato, I whispered. He raised his head and looked at me. I hadn't seen him in several days, and his gaze seemed even calmer to me than before. Perhaps I was the one who was calmer. Adrino, thank you for coming. What are you eating? I asked. Well, he looked into the bowl he held between his hands. It looks like soup or gruel, which is a type of oatmeal. I'm really not sure. It's probably the leftover soup we had for dinner. It was made with some sort of greasy something and tasted rancid, meaning bad, and stuck in my throat. Probably lard, Donato said in a soft voice. Lard comes from animals, and it's the fat on their body. It tastes very good to me. I thought about this and realized that everything was relative, meaning from a different perspective. Things that made me sick to my stomach tasted good to Donato because he had even less than I did. Isn't there any way to take off that shackle? I asked. No, the chain links are heavily soldered, meaning that they're hard to break, Donato explained. Believe me, in the beginning I tried everything. Besides, even if I could get the chain off, the door is locked and all the windows are barred. And what about Melania? Have you ever asked her for help? I have, and sometimes she looks at me with sympathy, when she looks at me at all. She comes in every night with food and changes my pail, but usually it's without a word. She's too scared of the maestro to ever go against him. Without Cosimo, Melania would have nothing, not even a place to sleep. I am grateful to her, though. Without her, I surely would have frozen or starved to death up here. I had a bitter taste in my mouth. Listening to Donato, I realized what true cowardice was. Cowardice means that you're afraid of something. Was I afraid to help him for fear of losing my apprenticeship and my chance to become a painter? I could tell someone what the maestro is doing to you, I said. Turn him into the authorities or send for my father. But Donato watched me in silence. But my voice choked. At that moment, all of my self-doubt and the difficulty of the situation overwhelmed me. It means it made him feel like he couldn't do anything. Come on now, Adrino. What's the matter with you? Are you crying for me? No, it's just that I really am such a coward. Adrino, yes, and I am selfish too, I said without taking a breath. I could get your freedom tomorrow, but the maestro would throw me out of the studio and my father would force me to return to tailoring. As pathetic as it is, this is my only chance to learn to be a painter. Donato pulled on the chain so that he could get closer to the window. Adrino, calm down a minute and listen to me. I don't expect you to sacrifice your dreams for me, nor do I want you to. I know that someday I will be free of this prison. Just know that you are my friend, and it gives me some strength. Besides, true freedom isn't in the street, or in Cosimo's studio, or in the air, or in the sea. Freedom is inside each of us. But think about it, Adrino. You really aren't free either. You have to obey the maestro and Melania and your father. They occupy your thoughts and perhaps even keep you from living your dreams. I can't move, but my time and my thoughts are my own. Do you see? I am freer than you in many ways. He was right. I was always at the mercy of someone else. Don't worry about me, he continued. You will help me when you're ready. I survived this long, and I am at peace with myself and others. I would venture to say that I'm even happy in my own way. Look, he pointed to the floor in the corner of the attic. From where I was, I could make out some marks in the dust. I can even draw and study perspective, symmetry, and composition. You know so much about art, so much more than I do, things I have never even heard of. Would you like to learn some of them? Yes, but how? Come up here when you can. I'll teach you what I can. I looked at him. In spite of his uncombed hair and his dirty, threadbare velvet doublet, meaning his shirt, he was an elegant man. I thought I had recognized my grandfather's wisdom in his eyes. Yes, Donato, I said, I will come up every chance I get. That is the end of chapter 5. Let's start chapter 6. The weeks that followed were the most intense that I can remember. During the day, I helped Melania clean and organize the house. I worked in the studio and took care of the horse. At night, I crept up the attic stairs to meet with Donato. We were careful to whisper and make as little noise as possible so as not to wake anyone sleeping below. I had taken some supplies from the studio, a pencil, some paper, a brush, and some paints, which Donato stored in the attic by the light of the moon. Where there was one, he showed me everything he had learned from the maestro, as well as what he'd discovered within the walls of his prison about light, shadow, reflections, lines, and angles. In the mornings, I dragged through my chores, but despite my exhaustion, meaning really, really tired, I was energized by my friendship with Donato and by everything he was teaching me. My father had sent me a letter at Christmas time saying that everyone at home was well and thinking of me, as well as a package of new clothes and some roasted chestnuts. I took the chestnuts up to the attic, where Donato and I celebrated the holiday on our own. For the first time since I'd arrived at the studio, I felt happy, though my happiness was always tempered, meaning lessened, by worry for Donato and the feeling of helplessness. But it wouldn't be long before something would happen to change the course of all our lives. "Boy!" Melania yelled. She was in top form that morning, meaning she's very angry. "Are you in love with the broom? You're asleep with her in your arms." Baldo and Piero laughed, and Marco looked me over from top to bottom, sneering, meaning making a mean face. "What's going on out there?" the maestro thundered from the depths of his bedchamber. "Nothing's going on," Melania shouted back. Then, in a voice only we could hear, she added, "Drooling Magpipe." She's calling him a mean name. "If you want to know what's going on, get out of bed and come see." He finally entered the studio that day after lunch. This was late, even for him. Baldo and I were preparing an egg yolk and vinegar adhesive, meaning something that sticks, while Piero and Marco worked on their projects, when we all heard 3 loud knocks on the front door. Baldo and I looked at each other. Who could it be? Since I'd been here, Cosimo de Flori's house had had only 2 regular visitors, the cold and the local priest, and the priest only came in the morning. "Melania, see who it is," bellowed the maestro from his seat by the fire. "Yes, yes, I'm going," she called from the kitchen. A moment later, she was at the studio door. "There's a nobleman outside," she said excitedly. A nobleman would have been somebody rich. "What did you say? Who is it?" growled Cosimo. "A nobleman with a lot of servants." I'd never seen Melania so nervous. The maestro stood up, and with Melania's help, slowly dragged his hunched figure down the hall. When they both disappeared behind the curtain that separated the entryway from the hallway, the 4 of us boys crept quietly after them and peered, meaning looked, as best we could through the narrow opening in the curtains. The maestro looked through the peephole, meaning the little round opening in the door, and then closed it with a bang. He straightened up, pushed back his hair with his hands, smoothed his robes, and opened the heavy door. There stood the Duke of Algora. I recognized him immediately. He was one of my father's best clients. I also recognized his wool cloak. It was my father's work. "Greetings, maestro," said the Duke in a dignified tone. "How do you do?" "Very well, my lord," said Cosimo. "But come in, please. It is much too cold outside." The Duke made a small signal with his hand, and 2 of his servants helped him remove his cloak. He entered the room slowly, looking around impassively, meaning he doesn't really care, as if expected of somebody from his class. The thin, red-clad form of his secretary, meaning his servant, slid in behind him. The other men in his entourage, meaning his group, stayed in the street by the luxurious, meaning very fancy, coach in which the Duke had arrived. The maestro closed the door and offered the Duke one of the chairs at the table in the entryway. Then he sat down and ordered Melania to fetch an oil lamp. We jumped back from the curtain as she brushed past us. She was so nervous she forgot to order us all back to the studio. We resumed our positions at the curtain. "Dear maestro," began the nobleman, "I would like to know if there is time in your schedule to take on a new project. If so, I have a commission for you." Now remember, commission means job. The maestro leaned on the edge of the table in order to stand up. Melania glared at us before she entered the room with the lamp, which she set down next to the Duke. "My lord, I am honored that you would come to me," said the maestro. The Duke smiled and removed his gloves. "How could I go elsewhere? Your marvelous allegory on freedom graces all the festivities in my grand ballroom." So this man has had the maestro do a picture for him before, and it stays in his ballroom where he hosts all his parties at his house. Allegory on freedom? Cosimo had painted an allegory on freedom? Cosimo de Flori, who kept his best student prisoner for being a better artist than he was. I felt my mouth fill with bile, meaning spit that tastes gross. This was my maestro, a man from whom I could learn only hypocrisy, meaning he could only learn to say one thing and then do another. My daughter is marrying, dear maestro, the Duke continued. Little Bianca, said Cosimo with a white smile. Not so little anymore, he laughed. She is nearly 15 years old. Now remember, during this time period, getting married at about 13 years old was normal because people did not live as long as we do now. So they had a shorter life, which means they got married as early as possible. So usually around 12 to 13. This girl is almost 15. Yes, she's very lovely, but the palace chapel is a bit, how shall I say, a bit unlovely. He's saying it's ugly. Yes, that's the word. My lady and I thought that if the wall behind the altar were painted, it would be much more attractive. But of course, my lady the Duchess has exquisite, meaning very good, taste. All of Florence is of that opinion. He's saying she knows good art when she sees it. How would the maestro know what all of Florence thinks when he never leaves his dirty old house, I wondered. It was all false praise. It means that the maestro is lying to this man so that he will hire him for this job. We hope that you, Maestro de Flori, will prepare a sketch of your ideas for the chapel walls painting. It will be a pleasure, my lord. I will draw and deliver it myself. The nobleman rose from his chair. He stretched his hand to his secretary, who handed him a small pouch. It jingled with coins. 40 ducats for your initial expenses. So he gave him $40 for his starting expenses or his starting needs. Said the Duke, placing the pouch on the table. When you present the sketch, if we like it, you will receive another payment. We will then determine the balance of your fee for the actual painting, which will depend on materials you need and the amount of work necessary to prepare the wall. Are you in agreement? Cosimo put his hand on the pouch. Thank you, my lord. You are always so generous. Both you and your distinguished wife will be satisfied. It will be my masterpiece, I can assure you. But one thing. Yes, the theme, my lord. What do you wish the painting to represent? So he's asking him, what should I paint? That is up to your imagination, my dear maestro. You are the artist. The Duke and his secretary moved towards the door, which the maestro opened for them. Just outside, the Duke put on his cloak with the help of 2 servants. The wedding is to be in early summer, he said. I hope you will remember that your time is limited, maestro. Of course. Do not worry, my lord. Cosimo closed the door, turned around, and pressed his hands to his stomach. From his expression, he seemed to be in great pain. Melania, he howled. God save me, exclaimed the servant. Build up the fire, it's freezing in this house, and make me some broth and hot wine. We hurried back to the studio. What's wrong with him? I asked Piero. Nothing, answered Piero in a thin voice. He has a commission. Adrino! The maestro's shout made my hair stand on end. Yes, maestro. Sharpen all the charcoals, meaning the pencils. Clean the brushes and the palettes. I want everything good as new. Do you understand? Yes, maestro. And from that moment on, the whole house was in a frenzy, meaning everyone is super busy. Melania worked in the kitchen and kept after us with a vengeance, meaning she won't leave them alone. I did whatever I was told, while Piero prepared the materials that would be used for the first sketch. Baldo cleaned the tables before putting down new sheets of paper. He took advantage of the confusion to go in and out of the kitchen, eating what he could find. Marco went through the enormous portfolio of drawings, separating the religious themes from the mythological and ornamental ones. The maestro had announced the theme of the fresco would be the marriage of the Virgin Mary. That night, I sat next to the barred window and described to Donato in detail everything that had happened that day. I wonder if he can handle this commission, I said. Why wouldn't he? He's done it many times before. But he gets so nervous. Besides, I think he is ill, meaning sick. Ill? Yes, I told you he's been acting strangely these last few weeks. Getting up late, the hot compresses and all that. Today he could barely walk to the front door without Melania's help. Donato was silent, and he sighed and rubbed his eyes. This will be your opportunity, Adrino. The painting in the Duke's chapel will be a fresco, a very complicated undertaking. So a fresco is a painting where you put plaster, meaning that white stuff that's on the walls. You put down new plaster, and while the plaster is still wet, you paint a picture in it so that the wall and the paint dry at the same time. And it makes it look very different than if you painted it after the plaster has been put on the wall. So it's very complicated. Cosimo will need all the help he can get. I'm sure he'll have something for you to do. Of course he will. I'll get to break the eggs to make the base. Cosimo covered his mouth to stifle a laugh. Let me tell you about fresco painting. That night I began to learn the best way to prepare the walls and the way to trace the drawings with perforated paper, how to plan the work according to colors, how to shade with the color still partially wet, and how to keep the color from running down the wall. We talked all night until a half-dozen chirping sparrows signaled the onset of a new day, or the start of a new day. Only then did I make my way back to my pallet so Melania wouldn't miss me when she woke up. That is the end of chapter 6.